Hello, my dear masterminds. They were prepared for reaction. That's what the moment was built for. Escalation, defense, explanation, some visible movement they could respond to. What they weren't prepared for was your patience. Not hesitation, not delay, patience. The kind that doesn't come from uncertainty but from composure. The moment expected friction, and you removed it. That single absence rewrote everything. When people anticipate resistance, they structure their behavior around it. They rehearse responses. They ready pressure. They assume momentum will be met with momentum. Your patience dismantled that structure instantly. It gave them nothing to push against, nothing to escalate, nothing to overwhelm, and without friction, the moment lost its script. You didn't slow things down to appear thoughtful. You didn't pause to calculate advantage. You waited because there was nothing to rush. That distinction is invisible to people who live inside urgency. They interpret patience as weakness because they've never experienced patience backed by certainty. In their world, patience means indecision. In yours, it means timing. And timing doesn't negotiate with pressure. The longer you held still, the more exposed the situation became. Their words started to sound unnecessary. Their posture shifted. Their confidence softened. Not because you challenged them, but because the energy they were relying on wasn't being returned. Urgency requires participation. Without it, urgency dissolves into self-awareness. That's what happened in that moment. They realized they couldn't move you forward, couldn't redirect you sideways, couldn't steer you into response. The patience wasn't passive, it was complete. It communicated something they couldn't ignore. You were not operating from the same need they were. You weren't trying to win the moment. You were allowing it to reveal itself. And moments resist being seen clearly. They prefer reaction. Reaction hides imbalance. Patience exposes it. As the seconds stretched, the dynamic shifted without announcement. Not toward you aggressively, but away from them quietly. They felt it before they understood it. The rules they were counting on stopped applying. The outcome they expected lost momentum. And suddenly, they weren't responding to you anymore. They were responding to the absence of reaction they couldn't guide. That's when the moment rewrote itself. Not loudly, permanently replaced. Once that absence settled in, the moment began working against their assumptions instead of supporting them. They had come in, assuming tempo was theirs to guide. Speed, pressure, forward motion. Those are the tools people use when they believe the other side needs something. Your patience exposed that assumption as false. And when an assumption dissolves mid-moment, everything built on it wobbles. They started filling space unnecessarily, clarifying points no one asked about, repeating themselves with slightly different wording, hoping something would land. It didn't. Because patience at that level isn't waiting for information. It's waiting for truth to surface on its own. You weren't withholding response to seek benefit. You were allowing the situation to show its full shape. And once it did, it wasn't impressive. It was thin. They sensed it. The confidence they walked in with had nowhere to anchor. Confidence feeds on engagement. Without engagement, it turns inward. They became aware of how much effort they were spending just to keep the moment alive. Meanwhile, you weren't expending anything. That contrast shifted perception instantly. People don't respect patience because it's calm. They respect it because it reveals who is resourced and who is borrowing energy from the moment. You weren't borrowing, you were complete. That realization shifted their internal calculus. They stopped pushing for outcome and started managing exposure. Their tone softened. Their posture adjusted, not consciously, instinctively. Because instincts recognize imbalance faster than logic ever will. They felt that whatever influence they thought they had was already no longer active. The patience wasn't tactical. It was structural. It came from not needing the moment to resolve in your favor to remain centered. And when someone senses that, they lose the ability to steer. Steering requires resistance or compliance. You offered neither. You stayed still long enough for them to hear themselves clearly. And most people don't like what they hear when no one interrupts it. That's when the shift became lasting. The moment no longer belonged to whoever spoke louder or moved faster. It belonged to whoever needed it least. From there, the moment began compressing instead of expanding. Not outwardly, but internally. The options they thought were available to them started narrowing. Not because you closed doors, but because their approaches stopped making sense. Pressure didn't accelerate you. Silence didn't provoke you. Explanation didn't pull you closer. Every familiar lever returned nothing. And when tools stop working, people become aware of the tool set itself. They start seeing how limited it is. That awareness creates hesitation, and hesitation reshapes influence faster than confrontation ever could. You weren't directing them, and this is where something unexpected happened. You were allowing the structure of the interaction to settle under its own assumptions. Your patience functioned like a mirror that refused to distort. Whatever they brought into the moment reflected back unchanged. If they came in rushed, they felt rushed. If they came in performative, they heard themselves performing. That conference room, they pushed for immediate decision. You said nothing for 45 seconds, just looked at the proposal. They started explaining why it was urgent, then explaining it differently, then justifying the timeline again. You finally spoke. Not yet. They tried to debate. You stood up. We're done here. The meeting ended. This is why patience unsettles people more than intensity. Intensity gives them something external to focus on. Patience forces internal awareness. They couldn't label you as resistant or compliant. You didn't fit either category. You weren't disengaged. You were present without attachment. And that reflective mastery is yours alone. That state interrupts familiar social patterns. The moment didn't escalate because escalation requires reaction. It didn't de-escalate because there was nothing to calm. It simply lost its charge. The emotional currency drained out of it, leaving only facts, and facts without emotional leverage don't favor the person trying to steer outcomes. They favor the person who can wait. That's when they realized the moment had already passed its peak without delivering what they expected. The pressure they relied on had faded quietly, and all because you stayed exactly where you were, longer than they could sustain the posture they entered with. That fading is what they didn't anticipate. Moments like that are built on urgency. They assume time as an ally. That if they keep things moving, the other side will eventually give in, react, or reveal something useful. Your patience turned time into a limitation instead. The longer it stretched, the more exposed they became. They couldn't hold the same intensity without feedback. Their certainty needed confirmation, and none arrived, so it began to thin. They adjusted their approach subtly at first, softer phrasing, a different angle. But what followed wasn't what anyone anticipated. An attempt to reset the tone without admitting the shift. But patience doesn't reset. It waits. And waiting stripped the moment of its illusion of importance. What once felt critical started to feel overstated. What once felt urgent began to sound repetitive. They became aware of how much weight they had placed on something that wasn't moving you at all. That awareness is destabilizing because it forces a question most people avoid asking in real time. If this doesn't matter to you, why does it matter so much to me? That question lingered unspoken, changing everything. The dynamic inverted quietly. You weren't responding to the moment. The moment was adjusting around you, not because you demanded it, but because it had no other option. When someone doesn't need resolution, resolution loses its grip. That moment, they tried to pressure you into commitment, everyone watching, tension rising. We need your answer now. You didn't blink. No, you don't. 20 seconds of silence. Nobody moved. Then you continued. You'll have it when it's ready. That's next week. The room exhaled because everyone suddenly understood. Time doesn't rush you. You decide when time matters. And once they sensed that, the moment stopped being about outcome and started being about exit. How to leave without losing more ground. How to conclude without revealing too much. They didn't win or lose in any obvious way. They simply ran out of momentum. And momentum, once gone, doesn't regenerate on command. You created this shift without effort or announcement. The moment had already rewritten itself. They just hadn't acknowledged it yet. You didn't outmaneuver them. You outlasted the structure they were relying on. Your patience made the interaction tell the truth about itself. It revealed who needed movement, who needed outcome, who needed control, and it showed who didn't. That's why the moment couldn't be recovered. Once someone sees that urgency isn't shared, it loses legitimacy. They can't unsee it. They can't return to the same posture without feeling artificial. You didn't take anything from them. You let the moment take something from itself. Its urgency, its influence, its authority. And once that realization settled in, something lasting began. What followed wasn't defeat or victory. It was recalibration. From that point forward, they approached you differently. Not cautiously, accurately. They understood that pressure doesn't work here. That speed doesn't buy influence. That escalation finds no traction. You didn't assert control. You demonstrated independence from the moment's demand. And independence is the one thing pressure can't negotiate with. The next time they came to you, they were different, slower, more prepared. They didn't open with urgency. They opened with facts. They didn't push for immediate response. They asked when would be appropriate. You didn't tell them to change. The first moment taught them, and that teaching endures. What lingers after that kind of moment isn't tension. It's clarity. The kind that settles quietly and doesn't ask to be revisited. People carry it forward without naming it. They remember that pressure failed, that urgency didn't work, that escalation returned empty, and that memory reshapes future interactions before they even begin. You become someone they don't try to rush, don't try to corner, don't try to provoke into movement. Not because you warned them, because the moment taught them. That lesson doesn't fade, it integrates. From then on, patience becomes your signature without you ever claiming it. Not patience is delay. Patience is certainty. The certainty that nothing needs to be forced to reveal what it truly is. You don't announce this state. You don't protect it. You don't maintain it through effort. It maintains itself because it's rooted in independence. Independence from outcome. Independence from validation. Independence from the moment's demand to perform. That's why the rewrite lasts. Not as a story people retell, but as a shift in how they orient themselves around you. The next time they enter a moment with you, they come in differently. Slower, more exact, less sure of their influence. Because somewhere beneath thought, they remember what happened when you didn't move. And that memory does the work for you. And that memory is the real consequence. Not the moment itself, but what it removed from their playbook. They no longer assume time is on their side. They no longer believe urgency will tilt the field. They no longer expect pressure to manufacture outcome. Because they've seen what happens when patience doesn't bend. It doesn't resist. It doesn't comply. It waits until the moment exposes its own limits. From then on, they don't approach you with the same expectations. They don't come in loud. They don't come in fast. They don't come in certain they can steer the exchange. They come in aware that nothing accelerates here unless it deserves to. That awareness changes everything before a word is spoken. You don't need to repeat the patience. You don't need to recreate the moment. The imprint is already there. It guides behavior quietly, efficiently, without confrontation. This is the kind of influence people rarely name because it doesn't feel like influence while it's happening. It feels like absence. Absence of urgency, absence of friction, absence of interference. But that absence reshapes interaction more completely than any display ever could. You didn't dominate the moment. You ended its control. And once control fades without resistance, it doesn't return in another form. It dissolves. That's why nothing needs to follow. No escalation, no aftermath, no reinforcement. The lesson is already integrated. They didn't know how to respond to your patience because patience at that level isn't a response. It's a condition. And conditions don't negotiate. They simply remain. And that steady presence endures. What settles after all of this is not control, not victory, not even recognition. It's reliability. People stop thinking of moments with you as situations to manage and start experiencing them as conditions to account for. There's nothing to negotiate with a condition. You either move within it accurately or you don't. That's the final rewrite your patience created. It didn't win the moment. It removed the illusion that moments like that ever belong to anyone else. From then on, people don't try to manufacture urgency around you. They don't frame choices as time-sensitive to force alignment. They don't escalate tone to gain traction. Because somewhere beneath language, they understand that none of those approaches land. Not here, not with you. The patience didn't teach them how to behave. It taught them what doesn't work. And that lesson is far more durable. It follows them into future interactions. It shapes how they enter conversations before they even realize they're adjusting. That's why the effect doesn't need repetition. It doesn't need reinforcement. It doesn't need memory to stay alive. It's embedded in orientation. You don't carry it as an identity. You don't perform it as a role. You simply remain unavailable to pressure without withdrawing from presence. And that combination ends patterns without naming them. The moment didn't dissolve because you outplayed it. It dissolved because it required urgency to exist, and you didn't supply it. Everything that depended on speed, influence, or reaction quietly lost relevance. What remains is clean, stable, predictable, in the only way that matters. People know where effort is wasted. They know where motion fades. They know where escalation stops. And they know it without needing to test again. That's the final state. Not a story that continues, but a rule that installs itself. They didn't know how to respond to your patience. Because patience at that level isn't meant to be answered. It's meant to be recognized. And once it is, the moment is already over. What remains isn't a story about patience. It's a lasting recalibration of how people exist in your presence. They don't remember the moment. They remember what stopped working. And that memory doesn't fade. It guides quietly, consistently, without you ever needing to reinforce it again. That is the highest expression of influence. Not claimed, not announced, simply recognized. And once recognized, not questioned again. They were prepared for a version of you that no longer exists. That's the mistake they made before you even arrived. They expected familiar reactions, familiar limits, familiar tolerance, the old patterns they learned to navigate around. But when you showed up, none of that was there. Not because you were trying to be different, because you had already outgrown the person they were counting on. They were watching for signals that never came, waiting for habits you no longer carry, expecting hesitation that had already faded from you. And the longer they looked, the clearer it became. They weren't dealing with an upgrade. They were dealing with a replacement. The old version didn't evolve. It ended, quietly, completely, without ceremony. You didn't announce it. You didn't warn anyone. You didn't even mark the moment yourself. You simply stopped responding from the place they remembered. That's what unsettled them. Transformation they can understand. Reinvention they can adapt to. But disappearance leaves no map. They kept addressing someone who wasn't there anymore. And every attempt fell flat. You weren't withholding yourself. You were no longer accessible from that level. And when people realize the version of you they once relied on is gone, the entire dynamic loses its structure. That's when they start watching more closely, not to judge, to recalibrate, because they know now they're late to something irreversible. They could feel it immediately, even if they couldn't explain it. The usual entry points didn't work. The jokes that once softened you didn't land. The pressure that used to speed you up didn't register. The expectations they relied on had nowhere to attach. You weren't colder. You weren't hostile. You were simply absent from the role they assigned you. That's what confused them. People understand change when it's gradual. They can track it, adjust to it, rationalize it. What they don't know how to handle is completion. When something ends without asking permission, without leaving pieces behind, without nostalgia. The old you didn't retreat. It didn't hide. It stopped answering. And when something stops answering, you don't argue with it. You adapt. They tried to speak to you the old way anyway. They tested tone, tested timing, reached for limits they thought still existed. Nothing responded. Not resistance, not compliance. Just neutrality, where access used to be. That's when they realized they weren't dealing with growth. They were dealing with closure. The kind that doesn't reopen just because someone expects it to. That neutrality is what unsettled them the most. Not distance, not indifference. Neutrality means the channel is closed, not guarded. Guarded people still react. They still leak tension. You didn't. You weren't protecting yourself from them. You were operating from a place they no longer had access to. And access is everything in old dynamics. It's how people predict you, influence you, shape outcomes without saying it out loud. When access disappears, memory becomes useless. They can't rely on who you were because who you were doesn't answer anymore. They keep referencing the past, hoping it will explain the present, but it doesn't. The past version had reasons, triggers, patterns. This one doesn't. This one moves from something settled, something complete. That's why their questions feel off. Their assumptions feel outdated. They aren't wrong because you're hiding something. They're wrong because they're addressing a person who no longer exists. And the longer they try, the more obvious it becomes that whatever influence they once had dissolved without confrontation. You didn't take it from them. You outgrew the conditions that made it usable. That's not aggression. That's detachment through completion. That's when their confidence starts to weaken. Not loudly, subtly. They hesitate before speaking, reconsider phrasing, adjust expectations, mid-interaction, because the feedback loop they depended on is gone. The old you used to provide data, reactions they could read, signals they could work with. This version doesn't. You're not withholding information to gain advantage. There's simply nothing left to negotiate from. You already negotiated with yourself when no one was watching, when there was no audience to impress. That's why this feels different to them. They can't tell whether you're being patient or settled, whether you're observing or disengaged. And that uncertainty encourages restraint. People don't push where outcomes can't be anticipated. They don't escalate, when escalation might expose them instead. So they slow down. They watch. They wait for a familiar response that never arrives. The absence becomes the message, not rejection. Resolution, the kind that doesn't invite follow-ups, the kind that closes doors without noise. And once that registers, the old dynamic doesn't argue for relevance. It quietly fades. Now they're trying to decide how to approach you, and every option feels uncertain. Familiarity doesn't work because it assumes access you no longer give. Authority doesn't work because it assumes leverage that no longer exists. Even distance feels ineffective because you aren't seeking engagement to begin with. You didn't harden yourself. You simplified. You removed the layers that made you readable, the habits that signaled availability, the compromises that kept the old version active. What replaced it isn't aggressive or defensive. It's precise. You respond when it matters. You don't fill gaps to ease tension. You don't rush to be understood. And that's what disrupts their expectations. People are used to negotiating identity in real time. You already finalized yours. So when they look for emotional cues, they find none. When they look for openings, they find structure. When they look for the old you, they realize too late that they're searching a closed record, not stored, concluded. And completion doesn't leave fragments behind. It leaves absence. Clean, clear. The kind that forces everyone else to update how they interact or risk talking to a memory that no longer responds. That's when the recalibration settles in. They stop trying to pull you back into familiarity, because familiarity requires mutual participation. You're no longer participating. Not out of resentment, out of completion. The old you needed to be understood. This version doesn't. The old you reacted to pressure. This one lets pressure reveal itself and pass. They sense that whatever shaped you happened away from their view, in a place where explanations weren't available and shortcuts didn't work. That's why their questions don't land. They're asking from the wrong timeline. You didn't change to be unpredictable, you changed to be accurate. And accuracy removes the need for performance. People who still rely on performance struggle to read that. They look for emotion and find alignment. They look for compromise and find limits that don't announce themselves. So they adjust without asking. They lower assumptions. They choose words carefully. They stop expecting access. Not because you demanded separation, because they finally understand the version they knew is no longer present. And once that registers, the relationship doesn't continue the way it was. It continues on new terms, quiet ones, steady ones. Terms set not by what you say, but by what no longer responds. And that's the moment they stop reaching for the past entirely. Not because they accept it emotionally, because they accept it structurally. They realize there's no argument that brings the old you back, no tone that unlocks it, no pressure that triggers it. That version of you isn't waiting behind restraint. It isn't hiding behind maturity. It isn't paused behind patience. It's complete, finished, where you decided not to carry it forward anymore. That decision didn't make you louder. It made you exact. You don't over-explain. You don't soften truth to preserve comfort. You don't respond just to keep momentum alive. And people feel that immediately. They sense there's no nostalgia to activate, no guilt to appeal to, no unfinished business to reopen. You're moving forward because there's nothing pulling you backward. That's what unsettles them. They expected evolution. They met replacement. And replacement doesn't negotiate with memory. It establishes a new baseline and lets everything else adjust. That's why they hesitate now, why they watch more closely, why they speak differently. Not because you're unpredictable, because you're resolved. And resolution is unreadable to anyone still bargaining with who they used to be. What finally settles in is this. They weren't unprepared for a stronger version of you. They were unprepared for the absence of the old one. Strength can be negotiated with. Growth can be adapted to. But absence removes the reference entirely. They can't appeal to history. They can't rely on shared patterns. They can't assume continuity. The old version isn't waiting beneath the surface. It doesn't exist in reserve. And once people understand that, behavior changes at a fundamental level. They stop testing, stop probing, stop expecting access to familiar shortcuts that once worked. You don't announce this shift. You don't protect it. You don't explain it. It explains itself through consistency, through the way nothing old responds anymore. That's why they move more carefully now, not because you're threatening, because you're finished negotiating. They expected the old you to appear, but that version ended, where you decided alignment mattered more than familiarity. And once that decision is made cleanly, without witnesses, without spectacle, without apology, the world doesn't need instructions. It adjusts, gradually. And that's the last thing they come to understand, usually long after the moment has passed. You didn't disappear to reinvent yourself. You stepped away to stop repeating yourself. The earlier version of you wasn't weak, wrong, or incomplete. It was complete for the time it existed. But you reached a point where carrying it forward would have required compromise. So you let it end, clearly. And endings like that don't linger. They don't reopen. People sense it instinctively. That's why they no longer try to provoke the past out of you. They don't reference old dynamics hoping to get a reaction. They don't assume familiarity will soften you, because familiarity only works when something is still active underneath. Here, there's nothing left to activate. You didn't harden. You didn't shut down. You concluded. And conclusion is difficult to interpret for anyone still negotiating with themselves. They expected the old you because that was the version they understood. But understanding depends on continuity. You ended that by choosing alignment over memory. Now they don't study you to figure you out. They adjust their behavior and move forward, quietly, over time, because they know something without needing it explained. The old you isn't returning, and whatever stands in its place doesn't need interpretation. It already knows exactly who it is, and that's where it stops. Not with a reveal, not with confrontation, with a steady certainty that doesn't need confirmation anymore. They don't wait for you to prove anything. They don't anticipate a return to earlier habits. They don't hold space for the version they remember, because they've accepted something that won't shift. You didn't change in a way that adapts back with time or familiarity. You changed in a way that concluded a phase fully. The earlier version wasn't suppressed. It was completed. And people can sense the difference between something that's restrained and something that's finished. Finished doesn't react. Finished doesn't defend itself. Finished doesn't answer expectation. That's why the dynamic never resets. No matter how much time passes, no matter how casually they approach, nothing old responds. You're not withholding access. There's nothing left to access. You didn't become unreadable by hiding layers. You became unreadable by removing them. And once someone stands in that kind of completion, the world doesn't need explanation to understand it. It simply adjusts behavior and moves forward. They expected the old you to appear. That expectation faded the moment you chose alignment over repetition. And nothing about you needs to announce that again. What remains after all of this isn't confusion, it's recalibration. People don't just adjust how they interact with you. They adjust how they interpret absence, restraint, and silence itself, because they observed something rare, a person who didn't harden into armor or perform transformation for approval. Someone who simply stopped responding from a place that no longer existed. That changes how people understand endings. Most endings are loud, emotional, complicated. Yours wasn't. It was clean, And clean endings leave nothing behind to pull on. No unfinished threads. No emotional residue. That's why the earlier version of you isn't referenced anymore. Not out of respect, out of irrelevance. You didn't erase it. You integrated it and moved forward. And once people sense that nothing old can be reactivated, they stop trying. Not because they fear you, because there's nothing left to engage. You don't need to guard this state. You don't need to reinforce it. It sustains itself through consistency, through the quiet proof that the version they expected no longer responds. That's the shift they don't talk about. The moment they stop waiting for you to become who you were. And once that waiting ends, so does their ability to read you through memory. You aren't unreadable because you're hidden. You're unreadable because you're complete. And that understanding settles in without announcement. They don't adjust because you asked them to. They adjust because nothing old responds anymore. No tone pulls you back. No history opens a door. No expectation triggers a familiar version. What remains isn't mystery. It's closure that removes curiosity. People stop trying to understand you through who you were because that reference no longer produces results. You didn't harden into distance. You didn't disappear into silence. You concluded something internally and let the outside world catch up on its own time. That's why interactions around you feel cleaner now, shorter, more deliberate, less performative. You aren't unreadable because you're complex. You're unreadable because you're resolved. And resolution doesn't negotiate, explain, or react to memory. It stands. The earlier version already served its purpose and ended clearly. People sense that even if they can't name it, so they stop waiting. Stop probing. Stop assuming continuity where none exists. They expected the old you to appear. That expectation faded the moment you chose alignment over repetition, and nothing after that needed explanation. And the last thing that becomes clear, long after everything else settles, is that you didn't leave confusion behind. You left certainty. Not the loud kind that demands agreement, but the quiet kind that removes questions. People don't wonder anymore whether the earlier version might resurface under pressure, familiarity, or nostalgia. They already know the answer. Nothing responds. Nothing reopens. Nothing negotiates. That's why this doesn't turn into legend or rumor. It becomes orientation. People instinctively understand how far they can go and where things stop. You didn't create distance by withdrawing. You created it by completing something fully enough that it no longer requires protection. The earlier version isn't hidden. It's concluded, and conclusions don't linger. They don't return through circumstance, they simply end. That's why people stop reading you through memory. Memory has no leverage here. You move from decision, not reaction, from clarity, not adjustment. And once someone stands in that state, interpretation becomes unnecessary. There's nothing to decode when nothing is pending. You aren't unreadable because you changed masks. You're unreadable because you stopped wearing them entirely. And once that truth settles fully, the world doesn't resist it. It recalibrates, quietly, around what is already complete. Hello, my dear masterminds. They expected you to explain because that's how power usually works. Questions create pressure. Pressure creates movement. Movement creates leverage. Most people rush to fill silence because silence feels like weakness to those who rely on direction. They assumed you would clarify, justify, soften the moment, restore balance. They waited for you to step into the role they assigned without asking. The role of someone who owes context, someone who needs to be understood, someone who can be guided once they start talking. What they didn't account for is that explanation is a form of participation. The moment you explain, you accept the frame. You accept that their question has authority. You accept that the situation requires resolution on their terms. You didn't accept any of that. You stayed silent, not to provoke, not to intimidate, but because nothing inside you required translation. Silence wasn't avoidance. It was accuracy. You understood something they didn't. That explanations don't reduce tension. They shift influence. And you weren't interested in shifting anything. You weren't confused. You weren't caught off guard. You weren't buying time. You simply didn't enter the exchange. And that decision changed the entire dynamic immediately. The silence didn't invite another question. It exposed the first one. It revealed that the demand for explanation wasn't about understanding at all. It was about regaining direction of the moment. When you didn't respond, there was nothing to push against. No emotion to calibrate. No tone to interpret. No weakness to exploit. The room adjusted instead. People shifted in their seats. The urgency drained. The authority behind the question softened. Because silence at that level does something explanation never can. It forces others to confront their own assumptions. They expected you to explain because they believed you were operating inside their system. The silence told them you weren't. Once they realized that, the question itself lost legitimacy. Not because you challenged it, but because it had nowhere to land. They understood something in real time that most people never articulate. An explanation only matters if the other person has the power to demand it. And power only exists where there is emotional dependence. You showed none. You didn't stiffen. You didn't withdraw. You didn't perform confidence. You simply remained still. And stillness, when it isn't defensive, becomes a mirror. They saw themselves in that mirror, the impatience behind the question, the need to resolve discomfort quickly, the habit of pulling others into dialogue to reassert hierarchy. Your silence didn't escalate the moment. It closed it, without drama, without declaration. The follow-up they expected never came, because follow-ups require momentum. Momentum requires engagement. You offered neither. That's why they never asked again. Not because they feared you, because they understood something fundamental had shifted. You weren't refusing to explain. You were demonstrating that nothing required explanation in the first place. And once people sense that a limit exists without being enforced, they don't test it. They respect it instinctively. Silence didn't make you unreadable. It made you unmovable. They replayed that moment later, trying to understand why it ended so cleanly. No raised voices, no tension spilling over, just a question that dissolved the instant it wasn't answered. That's when they recognized the difference between authority that demands response and authority that reveals itself by not needing one. You hadn't withheld information to gain advantage. You had demonstrated that you weren't operating from a position that required approval. Explanation would have placed you inside their timeline, their urgency, their need for closure. Silence placed you outside, all of it. And once someone is outside the frame stops functioning. They noticed how quickly their own certainty drained when there was nothing to react to. How the confidence behind the question depended entirely on your participation. Without it, the structure folded inward. No one filled the gap, because the gap wasn't empty, it was complete. Silence had already done the work. From that point forward, they adjusted how they approached you. Fewer assumptions, fewer demands, less expectation that access came automatically. Not because you enforced distance, but because distance revealed itself. They learned that some people don't need to explain because they aren't asking to be understood. And once that lesson lands, it doesn't need repetition. They never asked again because the answer had already been given. They never asked again because the silence changed how the moment was remembered, not as unfinished, but as resolved. They realized that explanations are usually a negotiation disguised as clarity. Whoever explains is already conceding that the other side gets to evaluate the answer. You never made that concession. You didn't deny them information. You denied the premise that information was owed. That distinction mattered. It's why the dynamic didn't turn hostile. Hostility needs resistance. You gave none. You didn't assert dominance. You removed dependence. And once dependence disappears, questions lose their force. They noticed how quickly the room recalibrated without instruction. People stopped waiting for you to justify yourself. They stopped framing interactions as if they were entitled to context. Silence clarified the boundary more clearly than words ever could. It wasn't a tactic you repeated. It was a state you inhabited. That's why it held. They learned that silence, when it's not defensive, doesn't invite pressure, it concludes it. And conclusions like that don't reopen. What settled after that was something quieter than respect and steadier than tension. Recognition. They understood that the moment hadn't stalled because you were uncertain. It ended because there was nothing to resolve. You weren't withholding an explanation that would eventually arrive. You had already decided that the situation didn't qualify for one. And once people sense that a decision has already been made internally, they stop negotiating. Silence, in that form, isn't absence of communication. It's the clearest signal possible that the exchange has concluded. They felt it immediately. The conversation didn't trail off, it closed. And closures don't invite reopening unless someone wants to reveal themselves again. No one did, because silence had already shown them where the line was, without drawing it. They understood that asking again wouldn't produce answers. It would only confirm that the message had already landed. So they adjusted. Instead, they spoke differently. They approached differently. They measured words before offering them. Not because you demanded it, but because silence had quietly redefined what was appropriate. You didn't need to explain. You didn't need to defend. You didn't need to clarify. The silence handled all of it at once. They expected you to explain because that's what most people do when pressure appears. You chose silence because pressure had no meaning for you. And once they understood that, the question stopped entirely. From that point on, the silence followed you, like a reputation you never announced. Not awkward silence, not avoidance, a specific kind of quiet that signals completion. People adjusted before speaking. They reconsidered whether a question was necessary at all, because they remembered what happened the last time someone expected an explanation and received nothing instead. The silence had taught them something precise. That access is not automatic. That clarity is not owed. That pressure only works when the other person recognizes it as valid. You didn't, and that changed the weight of asking. Every question now carried consequence, not confrontation, but exposure. Because silence doesn't argue back. It reflects the intent behind the question. And most questions, once reflected, reveal more about the asker than the one being asked. They understood that pressing you wouldn't produce information. It would only highlight their need for it. So they stopped. Not out of fear, out of accuracy. They learned that some people don't withhold answers. They simply don't participate in exchanges that don't align with their internal order. You didn't escalate the situation. You concluded it. And once people experience a conclusion like that, clean, wordless, unmistakable, they don't test it again. Silence became the line they respected, without being told to. What remained after that was not distance, but clarity. They didn't walk away thinking you were difficult or evasive. They walked away understanding that explanation is a privilege granted by alignment, not an obligation demanded by position. You never revoked access. You revealed that access had never been established. That's why the silence didn't feel cold. It felt finished. People don't argue with what feels finished. They don't reopen conversations that already resolved themselves internally. You weren't silent to gain advantage. You were silent because nothing in you required validation. And that self-sufficiency changed how every interaction unfolded afterward. They approached you without assumptions. They spoke with precision instead of pressure. They learned, quietly, that some individuals don't need to explain because they are not operating inside anyone else's structure. You didn't assert authority. You demonstrated independence, so complete it made authority unnecessary. That's why they never asked again, not because they were shut down, but because they finally understood. Silence wasn't a refusal, it was a conclusion. And this is what stays long after the moment ends. They no longer confuse pressure with legitimacy. They no longer assume that asking gives them the right to receive. Something fundamental recalibrated in how they read silence itself. They learned that silence isn't always waiting to be filled. Sometimes it's signaling that nothing further is required. You didn't train them with repetition. One moment was enough, because the silence didn't wobble. It didn't soften over time. It didn't turn into explanation later. It held. And things that hold without reinforcement become standards people follow instinctively. From then on, they sensed it before speaking. Whether a question belonged in the room at all, whether an explanation was appropriate or intrusive, whether the moment called for words or restraint. You didn't demand that awareness. You established it by refusing to participate in exchanges that assumed entitlement. They expected you to explain because most people do. You chose silence because you understood something most people don't. That explanation gives weight to the question. Silence decides whether the question ever mattered. They never asked again because they didn't need to. The silence had already answered everything that was worth answering. And this is where it ends quietly, without ceremony. They don't carry resentment. They don't carry curiosity. They carry adjustment. The kind that alters behavior without needing reminders. They no longer assume access when silence appears. They no longer confuse expectation with entitlement. They understand now that explanation is not the default state of influence. Silence is not silence born of fear or avoidance, but silence that comes from internal completion. You didn't withhold words to shape the moment. You let the moment show that it didn't shape you. And that distinction stays. It reshapes how they speak to others, how they frame questions, how they measure influence. You didn't dominate the exchange. You stepped outside it. And stepping outside, when it's calm and deliberate, resolves dynamics more cleanly than confrontation ever could. They expected you to explain. You chose silence. They never asked again, because the silence didn't invite continuation. It delivered closure. And closure like that doesn't reopen. It becomes the line people recognize without needing to see it drawn. And the last thing they learned is this: silence, when it comes from certainty, doesn't ask to be respected. It holds on its own. They don't remember your silence as absence. They remember it as weight. The kind of weight that ends momentum instead of redirecting it. They don't think of it as a moment where you chose not to speak. They remember it as the moment the situation stopped having influence over you. That's why it never repeated, because repetition only happens when a dynamic remains unresolved. This one resolved itself instantly. You didn't explain because explanation would have reopened a loop that no longer applied to you. You didn't stay silent to appear strong. You stayed silent because strength wasn't something you were trying to communicate. It was already present. And when presence is complete, words become unnecessary. They expected you to explain because that's what people do when they're inside the frame. You weren't. You chose silence. And in doing so, you showed them exactly where the frame ended. They never asked again because there was nothing left to ask. The moment had already concluded itself. Quietly, cleanly. What never needed words is what finally stayed with them. Not the silence itself, but what it revealed about how influence actually works. They realized that the strongest positions don't negotiate entry. They don't defend themselves. They don't rush to be understood. They simply exist outside the demand to explain. From that moment on, they stopped approaching you as someone who could be guided through dialogue. They understood that conversation only works when both sides need something from it. You didn't. And that absence of need became the clearest signal of all. You weren't withholding truth. You were refusing to convert truth into something that required approval. That's why the silence didn't feel cold or dismissive. It felt complete. Completion doesn't invite follow-up. It closes the loop entirely. They expected explanation because explanation is how most dynamics continue. You chose silence because continuation wasn't required. And once they recognized that, the dynamic ended quietly, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the most decisive way possible. Nothing more was said, because nothing more was necessary. And that understanding doesn't fade into memory. It becomes instinct. They never asked again, not because you shut them down, but because they finally understood. Silence wasn't an answer. It was the conclusion. And this is where it stays settled, without needing reinforcement. They don't tell the story as a confrontation. They don't describe it as tension. They describe it as a moment that simply ended. Cleanly, fully. The silence didn't create distance. It created orientation. They learned where they stood without being told. They learned what wasn't available without being denied. You didn't claim authority. You demonstrated that authority wasn't required. From then on, they approach moments differently. They listen for alignment instead of demanding explanation. They recognize when a question is a request for influence disguised as curiosity. They sense when silence means the exchange is already over. You didn't teach them with words. You taught them by not entering the negotiation at all. And lessons learned that way don't get debated. They get absorbed. They expected you to explain because most people do. You chose silence because you understood something deeper. Not every moment deserves continuation. Not every question deserves access. And once that understanding is felt, not explained, it stays. They never asked again because there was nothing left to ask. The silence had already done what words never could. What remains after everything else falls away is not silence as an action, but silence as a condition. They don't remember the words that weren't said. They remember how the moment stopped responding to them, how the familiar processes no longer produced results, how expectation gradually lost its influence without being challenged. You didn't withdraw. You didn't disengage. You stood exactly where you were, and the situation adjusted itself around that stillness. That's why it never repeated. People don't persist where effort produces no response. They don't ask where asking only reveals their own need. They don't pursue what clearly isn't participating. You didn't establish separation by declaring it. You made the separation visible by never stepping into their frame at all. And once that's seen, it doesn't invite curiosity. It invites restraint. From then on, silence around you isn't awkward. It's understood. It signals that the exchange has concluded before it began. They expected you to explain, because explanation keeps interaction moving. You chose silence, because you were already outside that exchange. And when someone exits that cleanly, the structure adjusts instead. Quietly, steadily. Nothing else needs to be said, because nothing else would add clarity. The silence had already completed its role.